Hello kings, queens, and majesties, welcome to WhaleStat. I am Slice of Otaku, and as of right now, the most controversial character in Genshin Impact would easily have to be the recently released 5-star Pyro Bow user, Yoimiya. Now, oftentimes these sorts of conversations within the community end up being pretty divisive, and perhaps things may have been that way at the start, but at this point it would seem that the vast majority of players, having now played with the character extensively, have come to the general consensus that Yoimiya's gameplay leaves a lot to be desired, and so somehow it would seem that both waifu wanters and meta slaves have been able to put aside their differences for the sake of letting miHoYo know that Yoimiya absolutely needs some changes. However, the fact still remains that the character is in the game and is also featured on the current banner, and so there are bound to be those who will actually end up picking her up. And so with that, fingers crossed miHoYo does end up improving her, but this video will be a guide for her current self as per usual, with the added addition of certain issues with her kit that deserve to be addressed. We'll be going over her talents, skills, optimal artifacts, weapons, and constellations, all of which you can find timestamps for on the video and in the description below. Beginning with her talents, Yoimiya's normal attack is a bit interesting as the bulk of her damage with it happens to be tied to the last 3 hits. And so as a character very much dependent on her normal attack string, delivering it to completion is very important, which on one hand is cool because her auto attack numbers are better than most, but on the other is actually pretty dreadful as any sort of interruption prevents you from seeing the full extent of that damage, essentially starting you back at square one if you ever happen to move or take damage, which really sucks when considering 2 things. 1, the range on her auto attack is really bad, so you cannot rely on distance at all. And 2, enemies move, so it'll be pretty hard to concentrate this damage if things are moving around. If Yoimiya isn't to move and the enemies can, it's pretty much random who she will end up hitting. All the while, Yoimiya is the last character you will want standing still because she dies really easily. Trust me, I know this all too well from trying to record gameplay with her. Her charge attacks are pretty standard with the addition of an extra charge level, as she is able to generate a maximum of 3 kindling arrows, which have built-in homing. And on paper, this sounds so cool, but unfortunately in practice, I kinda hate it, because when used from afar, which is pretty much any time you are charge attacking with a bow, they don't lock onto anything. Like, I was at the very least hoping to have her be my KFC main for the sake of catching birds mid-flight, but that barely ever works as intended. Yoimiya's elemental skill increases the damage of her normal attacks and also converts them to pyro damage for 10 seconds. This doesn't work with her level 2 charge attacks and concludes if she leads the field. This skill is pretty much her bread and butter for the sake of dealing pyro damage, but interestingly enough, is not worth much investment at all. I honestly made the mistake of overvaluing its progression a bit, when in reality, each level pretty much only nets you about a 3% damage increase, which is extremely negligible, as you could instead focus on building up her normal attacks considering it is the basis for all of this. As for Elemental Burst, this is the character's only means of AoE damage, but that's just for the initial instance of it, which isn't all too impressive by its lonesome. However, from this, one enemy will be marked so that all normal, charged, plunging, elemental skill, and elemental burst attacks by party members besides Yoimiya herself trigger an explosion of AoE pyro damage. And when a marked enemy dies before the end of this 10-second duration, they then pass the mark on to another nearby enemy who then takes on the remaining duration. An explosion like this can be triggered once every 2 seconds, and if Yoimiya goes down during all of this, the effects are deactivated. And I don't like this burst. I was unsure of it back when we first learned of the character, and now after using it, I can definitively say that I do not like it. And a big part of the reason why this would have to be the fact that I have missed with it on so many occasions. Also, the use of AoE damage here implies that you would be making use of this against a group of enemies, and with that, the inability to designate a specific target of this marking really sucks, especially when you find yourself facing off against especially bulky enemies. Being able to make the most of this by spreading it to all the little guys isn't even something you can actively decide to do. Additionally, I don't really like being forced to switch off of my team's main DPS for the sake of getting this burst to do anything. And from the very moment I had heard of this being the case, I just couldn't seem to wrap my head around any sort of reasoning for this. It honestly just feels like an attempt at checks and balances for the character in the case of an already underwhelming kit. Now as for her passives, Tricks of the Troublemaker causes normal attack shots during the use of her elemental skill to increase her pyro damage bonus by 2% on a hit, which lasts for 3 seconds with a maximum of 10 stacks. This is pretty cool, but because of the lumen limitations and issues with her normal attacks and skill, isn't all too great. Next, we have Summer Night's Dawn. Using your elemental burst causes party members besides Yoimiya to gain an attack increase of 10% for 15 seconds, with an additional attack bonus being added onto that based on the number of stacks she possesses from her previous passive for a benefit of plus 1% per stack. This is another support aspect of her kit that I feel splits her focus in a very odd way. And overall, I just find the design elements of Yoimiya's talents to be pretty weird, as with a fireworks dealer you would expect her to be pretty good at AoE damage, yet it is quite the contrary. And that inflexibility is pretty lousy for a game where most enemies tend to swarm you rather than approaching one-on-one. But moving on, we have Constellations, of which I have none. At C1, the marks created by Yoimiya's elemental burst last for an additional 4 seconds. Beyond that, when an opponent affected by the mark is defeated within this duration, her attack is increased by 20% for 20 seconds. And I just don't understand this at all. Thus far, her burst has been heavily skewed towards being supported for everyone besides herself, yet for whatever reason, suddenly she is to benefit despite being off field. It is just so strange. But to follow this up, at Constellation 2, when Yoimiya's pyro damage lands a critical hit, she gains a 25% pyro damage bonus for 6 seconds, which can be triggered even when she isn't the active character, which pretty much boils down to her marks being critical hits. And so with that, it would seem that Yoimiya is expected to be a powerhouse after everything is said and done, and you eventually switch back to her, which isn't bad. It's just the fact that you need constellations for her burst to even benefit her is very strange indeed to me. At Constellation 4, when Yoimiya's mark triggers an explosion, the cooldown of her elemental skill is decreased by 1.2 seconds, which in an ideal situation will just quicken that rotation and set her up for even more sooner. But if it takes too long to kill whoever is randomly branded with this mark, it may end up lacking in worth. But finally, for her C6, with her elemental skill, Yoimiya's normal attacks have a 50% chance to fire an extra pyro arrow, which deals 60% of its original damage and is considered normal attack damage. This is pretty neat, but perhaps not C6 level for me at least. In the realm of weapons, Thundering Pulse is quite clearly her best in slot. That crit damage substat is godly, and the increase to her attack by 20% at base is wonderful. Maintaining 2 Thunder Emblem stacks from having less than 100% energy and hitting with your normal attack will pretty much be a constant, so say hello to an additional 24% damage to your normal attacks, and make that 40% whenever you use her elemental skill. And honestly, if you only keep her on the field when your skill is ready or in use, that is more like a constant 40% increase, so yeah, pretty good stuff there. Besides that, Amos Bow is valid for upping her normal and charge attack damage, albeit to a lesser maximum. But then again, you will very rarely use her charge attacks, and her range is abysmal, so those arrows will not be traveling very far to make sure that you are maximizing that damage. Skyward Heart may perhaps make up for her absent AoE damage by doing physical AoE damage, but that might just be like putting a bandage on a gaping wound. The new 4-star craftable Yoimiya is something I have yet to get my hands on, but it seems pretty fitting as it increases normal attack damage by 16% at base, and when a character's energy reaches 100%, the effect is also increased by 100%. Which for Yoimiya, as a character whose elemental burst you can pretty much just ignore, this is like a 5-star weapon itself. In fact, at further refinements, especially a feasible refinement 5, I would go as far as to argue that if it wasn't for the crit damage substat of Thundering Pulse, it would actually stand to be her best weapon. But if you still want to make use of her burst and don't have 5-star weapons galore, Rust is certainly a viable option, which in sacrificing 10% of the damage from her already pathetic charge attacks, you can empower your normal attack damage by 40% at base. If nothing else, I do appreciate her weapon versatility. Moving on to her artifacts, truth be told, I really only ever use 4-piece Shimenawa's Reminiscence. At 2-piece, you have an effect identical to 2-piece Gladiators as you benefit from an additional 18% to your attack damage. Meanwhile, with 4-piece, when casting an elemental skill, which is anytime you're trying to deal damage with this character, if she has 15 or more energy, she loses 15, and her normal, charged, and plunge attack damage is increased by 50% for 10 seconds, which is exactly the duration of her elemental skill. Again, you do not need her elemental burst. This can keep you away from it for the sake of Thundering Pulse, but also works with Yoimiya in maintaining 100%, because that energy is not hard to accumulate at all once you are dealing that pyro damage. If you don't have any good artifacts for this set, which is very understandable as it is relatively new, 2-piece of this or Gladiators along with 2-piece Crimson Witch for that additional pyro damage is acceptable as well. In terms of main stats, you will want your standard DPS build, attack sands, pyro damage goblet, and either crit rate or crit damage circlet depending on what you may be lacking in. Now in regards to teams, unfortunately as to make up for the glaring issues in her kit, Yoimiya is a very needy character right now. Her best teams are all for the most part composed of the best support characters currently in the game, which when it comes to the Spiral Abyss may actually be a bit annoying because you do in fact need 2 teams to complete it. And in my personal experience, there are pretty much 2 characters that I cannot play her without, at least not effectively: Bennett and Zhongli. Bennett is obviously incredible for his benefits to attack within the AoE Biz Burst and its healing. And because we do not want to be moving with Yoimiya to make the most of her normal attack damage, he's pretty great. Next, Zhongli makes it so that we can take direct hits to the face without being staggered and have our normal attack string interrupted. Yoimiya without heals and shields dies really quickly, and so these two are pretty much like her life support. And as much as I frequently play with and enjoy these 2 characters, this makes team building for her very lackluster, as there isn't much room for diversity. Initially, I was intent on running a fireworks comp with her, given her whole character theme and such, but man, she is just so stiff, yet so squishy, that if Beto's burst is not up, I feel very exposed. And listen, for as good as Zhongli is, I mean, I absolutely adore the guy, he is definitely in my top 5 characters, being forced to have him on a team really is not the wave. Like for sure, I can drop Bennett if it really needs to be the case, yet Zhongli, a 5-star character mind you, almost feels like a necessity. Which is pretty ironic considering Zhongli at one point desperately needed a buff on account of player dissatisfaction, so perhaps this is an omen of what is to come later. But right now, when it comes to each and every team involving Yoimiya, I would, with the exception of making this content, choose another character 10 out of 10 times, which is not good at all because on my own, I tend to just play whatever I feel like in the moment. But yeah guys, that just about does it for our coverage of Yoimiya in this video. This was certainly a different experience creation wise, but I really hope we can do this again in the event that she ends up being fixed by MiHoYo in the future. If you'd like to be here for all that and more, be sure to subscribe to WhaleStat with notifications on. I've been your host, Slice of Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.